Welcome to the Jackson Rudolph podcast. I am your host, Jackson Rudolph, and this is episode 3, the best forms I've ever seen. Now, I want to get started today with a quick apology because I know that I probably sound a little bit under the weather. I was competing at the Toronto tournament, International Tournament of Martial Arts Championships over the weekend, and obviously from all the yelling and stuff, being in Toronto in the cold weather, got a little bit of a cold myself, and so the voice is not quite what it normally is today, but we're going to persevere. We're going to get through it here for episode 3. And so as you heard, the discussion topic is the best forms that I've ever seen. Now, this is completely opinion-based. This is me going as a spectator at a karate tournament. What are the best forms that I've ever sat and watched in person, with one exception? There is one form on this list that is not a form that I watched in person, but I couldn't help but leave it off the list. I've only seen it on YouTube because I wasn't even competing when this form was done, but I had to include it because of who this person is and because of the form that this person performed. And the way that I've split this up is I picked 3 empty hand forms, 3 weapons forms, and then there's an extra pick, which is simply the best form that I ever watched with my own eyes in competition. Again, this is my opinion as a spectator, the forms that I enjoyed the most watching. And this is in no particular order. These are just some of the best forms that I could think of in no particular order. So we're starting off with, in my opinion, the greatest CMX competitor of all time, if you consider both forms and weapons, Matt Emig. Matt Emig at the US Open in 2008, his empty hand, his musical form in that ISKA US Open finals was incredible. This was the form where he did a rodeo cork, which he had done in forms before, but he did a rodeo cork, which if you don't know what that is, it's a corkscrew, which is a backflip with a full twist going off of one leg. And calling it a rodeo means that he's actually grabbing his right leg throughout the entirety of that technique. But Matt took it another step further in this form, where instead of just grabbing the right leg on the rodeo cork, he proceeded to land on his left foot only, continue holding that right leg, and spin around twice, showing off the fact that he had more control than anybody else with that technique, and then proceeding on with the rest of his form. Later on in that form, he also does what's called a brandy into a statue. So we talk about people doing an aerial in a form, which is a no-handed cartwheel. Matt in this form did a brandy, which is a no-handed round-off, to set up a statue, which is essentially a big air backflip in which you get way up in the air and kind of turn sideways in the middle of the flip and grab your leg, grab the right leg as you're coming down out of the flip. That was a signature move of Matt's. He liked to open a lot of his forms, especially like the mid-2000s. He opened a lot of his forms with a standing statue that's also really impressive. But seeing the height that he got off of a brandy, which is a round off with no hands, seeing the height that Matt could get off of that was incredible. And to put the icing on the cake, this form was done in my favorite uniform of all time, which is back when Team Paul Mitchell, this is before I was on the team, Team Paul Mitchell had this run of shampoo bottle uniforms where like the back of the uniform had these like shampoo bottle characters holding martial arts weapons, and then there was like a shampoo bottle character on the leg. They were the coolest uniforms that Paul Mitchell's ever had, and Matt is wearing one of those shampoo bottle uniforms during this form. And so from the tricks that he was doing, to the cleanliness of the technique, to the overall execution, to the uniform that he was wearing, Matt Emig, US Open 2008, one of the best forms that I've ever seen. Moving on to another Paul Mitchell member, we have Austin Crane at the US Open in 2013. Now, Austin Crane did a lot of really, really good kama forms in his day, but in my opinion, the best form that I ever saw him run was an empty hand form that he ran in the men's forms final at the US Open ISKA 2013. And part of what made this form so impressive was how stacked the division was. So this was the year that Sen Gao was having a lot of success in the Chinese forms division. It was winning overalls there. But even if we look at just hardstyle, this men's forms division was Austin Crane, Michael Guthrie, the best tricker to ever live, and Micah Carnes, who's probably one of the cleanest trickers to ever be in sport karate. So the division was absolutely stacked. Now, Austin Crane does not wind up winning this division, and I'm not saying that I think that Austin should have won over this person or the other person, but in my opinion, this form that Austin ran was one of the best forms that I've ever seen. He opened with one of his signature moves, which is a double Webster or a Webster swing through Webster, whatever you want to call it. Basically, he did the Webster, which is the front flip off of one foot, And then instead of landing that, he just landed on the one foot and swung through again to go into another front flip, landing that in the splits. That was the signature of Austin's. And then later in the form, we just talked about how Matt in his form did the brandy twist statue. Well, Austin Crane in 2013 proceeds to do what I believe is called a double statue. So what you can imagine here is it's another big air trick where you're doing it's a backflip variation where you kind of turn to the side. But what Austin did here is instead of just grabbing the first leg and holding that statue position as he comes out of the flip, in the middle of the flip, he actually switched legs. So he went from grabbing one leg, shifting his body weight over to the other side and grabbing the other leg, all before coming down and then rotating into a punch. So just that singular move was one of the most impressive power moves power tricks that I've ever seen been done in a form. And also, this is Austin Crane had kind of made a comeback at this point. He had a really, really, really successful junior career, and then kind of in his transition to the adult division, went to college and was in and out a little bit. And so this was kind of like Austin Crane's comeback moment was this form. And I think that part of that is what played into the reason that I thought it was so good. And then also, I'll admit my Paul Mitchell bias. I think that Austin may have been our only Paul Mitchell representative in that particular division. So I will admit some Paul Mitchell bias there in talking about how great that Austin Crane form was. And I don't take anything away from the other forms. Michael Guthrie's form that night was incredible. Micah Carnes' form that night was incredible. It was a stacked division through and through. But for whatever reason, Austin's is the one that stands out to me. And now for the next form, the last empty hand form that we're going to talk about, Brendon Heuer at the Warrior Cup in 2008. Now, Brendon Heuer, Sideswipe member, Team AKA member, brother of Sideswipe and Team Paul Mitchell member Dana Heuer. And in 2008, there's some forms that you see that are just fun. There's some forms that you watch and it's just a fun form that you can just enjoy watching whenever. And that's what Brendon Heuer's form was in 2008. He was doing the form to Kiss Kiss, which I believe is by Chris Brown and T-Pain. And it was just fun to watch him do this form. Not only, did he have clean hands, clean stances, fast execution, great tricks, but one of the things that was probably one of the greatest swagger moments in the history of sport karate, well, that might be a bold statement, but I'll just say it. One of the greatest swagger moments in the history of sport karate was he walked into this tricking pass that was it was front handspring to cartwheel, back handspring to a flash kick. So already a much more advanced corner pass than what most people do, which is the running round off flash kick or cartwheel flash kick. But what's most important there is not the fact that he did front handspring, cartwheel, back handspring, and the flash. It's the fact that he would literally walk into it. You typically see people take a running start into their corner pass. Brendon Heuer literally during this form that season, he would take 3 or 4 steps just walking from corner to corner of the ring. And then when he got just about to the middle of the ring, he would take off into this tricking combination out of nowhere. Extremely impressive, extremely creative. And so that Brendon Heuer form is one that sticks out in my mind as one of the best forms that I've ever watched in person. And in that particular form, he wound up winning the Warrior Cup with that form. And so now as we switch over to weapons, it's only appropriate that we go ahead and slide in our advertisement for the Flow System at this juncture. The Flow System is a one-of-a-kind weapons training curriculum that I created. Mackenzie Emery is the comma instructor of the curriculum. I am the bow staff instructor of the curriculum. And one of the cornerstones of the curriculum is the instructor training. So it's not just a weapons program with technique and combos and forms, but it also teaches instructors how to teach a weapons curriculum. Visit theflowsystem.tv for more information. So now we're jumping into some of the weapons forms that are some of the best forms that I have ever watched. The first one is a form that I watched in person, one of the earliest forms that I can remember watching in person. This was Billy Ledger at the Pan American Internationals in 2007. Now, many of you may not know the name Billy Ledger, but you absolutely should. He was on Team Straight Up, and he is probably one of the most ahead of his time bow staff competitors that I've ever seen. He won the overall with this particular form, and just the number of tricks that he did back in 2007. You got to remember, this is 12, almost 13 years ago that he was doing this, and he was doing things like throwing the bow up, spinning around, catching it behind his head. He was throwing the bow at awkward angles from behind his back that nobody had done before, and he was comboing bow tricks together in a way that was unique that nobody had ever done before. And so one of the reasons that a lot of people may not have heard of Billy Ledger is because he ran such a difficult form for that time period that he made a lot of mistakes. He had some drops here and there. I remember he would drop very often. But when he hit his form, it was incredible because he was doing so many things that other people at the time wouldn't have even dreamed of trying in their form. And so Billy Ledger, that is one of the few Billy Ledger videos that is on YouTube. I highly, highly recommend going and checking that out. That is Billy Ledger, Ledger, Pan American Internationals 2007. And that one is just... I picked that one just because of how far ahead of its time it was and the amount of inspiration that it gave me to start going out and trying to push the boundary of bow staff tricks myself. Moving on to the next one, we actually have a soft style form here. Austin Jorgensen, Diamond Nationals 2013, his drunken broadsword form or straight sword form was one of the best weapons forms that I've ever seen. Some of the tricks that he did in this form were so unique and so creative. Like nobody else has tried to recreate some of the things that Austin Jorgensen did in this form that won him a diamond ring. And for a soft stylist, for a Chinese, for a Kung Fu martial artist to win a diamond ring is a big deal. Like there's only a few people in history that have done that. I think DX did it. I think either one or both of the Pak brothers did it, and there's others as well. Ming Lu did it, but it's very difficult to win a diamond ring with a Chinese or a Wushu style form, and Austin Jorgensen did just that. Now, there are two tricks in this form that were the most notable to me. The first one that he did was early in the form, and he did a kip-up catch of the sword. So what he did was he wound up, I think he did a corkscrew where he wound up landing on his side. So he did a corkscrew to his side, which is a very difficult wushu move, with the sword kind of stabbing out in front of him. And then what he did was he rolled over and he set the sword up in front of him. He threw the sword up into the air with both hands, rocked his legs back for a kip up, which, by the way, if you don't know what a kip up is, it's when somebody's on the ground and they lean back onto their shoulders and then they kind of lift their hips up and they kick their legs forward and they kind of jump all the way up to their feet from that position. What Austin Jorgensen did was he brought his legs up and he pushed his legs forward, and as he pushed his legs forward to stand up, he actually kicked the sword up further into the air as he was standing up from the kip up, and then just reached up super casually and just catch the sword in perfect position. I've never even seen anybody else try to do something like that. And then later in the form, and to me what sealed the deal for him winning that particular diamond ring, he proceeds to set this throw up where he literally just chucks the sword up into the air, does a forward roll to his knee, and then reaches back behind him and catches the sword perfectly once again. Like the accuracy that it takes to throw the sword in exactly the place that you want it so that after you do a forward roll, you can reach back behind your head and make that catch. That's incredibly difficult to do. Not to mention the fact that there were other manipulations that Austin Jorgensen did in this form. Super fast manipulations of the straight sword. Some of the stances that he would hit in that drunken style form were absolutely incredible. And also, Diamond Nationals historically has one of the most electric crowds in the history of sport karate. If you are somebody that sits in the crowd at Diamond Nationals and goes crazy, I respect you, because I enjoy that atmosphere every time I get up there and I'm going for a diamond ring. That atmosphere is just incredible. But you can imagine what that atmosphere would be like when you get Austin Jorgensen going up there acting like a drunk guy, because that's the style of his form, and performing that form to the song Tequila. The atmosphere was ridiculous. The crowd was going crazy. And Austin Jorgensen landed some incredible, incredible tricks that night. Tricks that I've never seen anything like. And that's why I give Austin Jorgensen a spot on this list of some of the best forms that I have ever seen. Now, the next one that we get to is admittedly the form that I did not watch in person. This is a form from the 2004 Super Grands, and it's Casey Marx. Casey Marx is one of the few competitors to have kind of two separate eras of her career where she was incredibly dominant and incredibly skilled in two different ways. Like early on in Casey's career, in my opinion at least, what I see from going back and looking at the videos, obviously I wasn't around for a lot of it, but from what I see in going back and looking at the videos is she initially was winning on execution. Like she was just a little bit faster, a little bit stronger, a little bit better of a showman than everybody else. And she also had the fact that she was the first person to do a bow staff releasing competition. So when she would throw the bow in the air, people would go crazy. And that is what made Casey great. But then later on in her career, and I'd say that kind of shift happened around this time period from like 2004-ish forward. Later on in her career, Casey became even more of a technician. We saw her technique get perfected. It seems like even recently, within the past 3 or 4 years, I've seen Casey compete, and it seems like every strike is done with this level of surgical precision that is unmatched by anybody that I've ever seen. But rewinding that back to 2004 Super Grands, this particular form, it's done. You can find this video on YouTube as well. Casey Marks 2004 Super Grands. It was done on like a tiki stage. I understand that Super Grands always has like a different theme to their night show, or at least that's the vibe that I get from watching the YouTube videos. And this was like a tiki Hawaiian type theme stage. But the form that Casey did, from technical execution and creativity, was unmatched by anything that I've ever seen. And what I mean by creativity is I don't mean creativity of tricks. When we use creativity in modern weapons competition, like today when I say creativity, you think about people throwing the bow at different angles, people catching the bow at different angles, people trying to find new ways to roll the bow around their body. But what Casey did, and also Casey's student Lauren Carney, who is my coach, what both of those people did very well is they did an extremely good job of finding creativity without throwing their bow or significantly upping the level of difficulty, but just finding different ways to strike, different ways to do butterfly spins, roll the bow around the hand, manipulate the wrist, manipulate the elbow, to get into these positions that when you see it happen at full speed, it looks cool, but you don't fully understand it, and that adds to the mystery of it, and that's what makes it so special. And so Casey Marks in that Super Grands form, from technical execution to the creativity of some of the movements that she was doing, and also just the historical significance of who Casey Marks is. That's why the Casey Marks 2004 Super Grands form makes my list, even though that was the one form on the list that I unfortunately did not get to watch in person. I guess it had strong enough of an impression on me from the YouTube video that it made the list. So now, before we get into the number one, in my opinion, the best form that I ever watched in person, before we get into that, I do want to give a couple of honorable mentions that I think are very, very important. I remember when I was a kid coming up on the circuit, there would be these battles in the 14 to 17 weapons runoffs between Josh Corton with his sword and Corey Lutkus with his bow that were insane. I mean, these guys would throw down. Josh Corton was one of the first people to really innovate sword releases, and he would do them at very high speeds. And Corey Lutkus was extremely influential in the development of a ton of bow staff tricks that we still see used today. Corey Lutkus had a lot of body rolls that he made popular. Scarecrow's popularity, where you continue rolling the bow around your neck over and over again, is in large part due to Corey Lutkus. Corey Lutkus was one of the first people to ever actually combo bow tricks together, 2-3 tricks at a time. And honestly, if it wasn't for the fact that Josh and Corey each threw down so many great forms against each other, they probably would have been on this list not just as honorable mentions. Like, the reason that they are honorable mentions is because they ran so many great forms against each other that I couldn't just pick one to put on the list. So I couldn't point out like, this particular form was the best form that Corey did, because he had multiple forms that I would say were at that level. And same thing for Josh Corton. So they would trade back and forth. Being a bow guy, I always loved Corey, but Josh Corton was super impressive as well. The things that he was doing with his sword releases were incredible. Watching those battles and runoffs between those two guys was absolutely incredible. And those forms over the course of those 2 or 3 years that they were battling against each other absolutely deserve to be on this list. Another one for historical significance is any form that Nate Andrade did as the Showtime forms. That was his nickname, was Showtime. He would literally go to the back of the ring and he would give this big it's showtime before he would run a form. And that's exactly what it was. Because what Nate would do was he would do things that nobody else thought of doing in bow forms because they were too hard to do. Different voodoo child variations, the number of different body roll variations that Nate could do and that he did successfully in forms is insane. Nate is extremely influential in the history of bow staff trick development, because pretty much any variation of a body roll that you see today, Nate and his training partner Ross Levine probably had something to do with. So the Nate Showtime forms, those are definitely some of the most influential bow forms when it comes to kind of the progression in the history of bow staff tricks. And then there's two other Team Paul Mitchell members that I just want to give mention here because once again, they had many, many forms that were just incredible throughout their careers. So I can't go without mentioning the names of Steve Tirada and Rudy Raynon. Another two guys that I watched in person. Now keep in mind, this list is I'm trying to limit it to people that I only watched in person, and I'm also trying to make sure that I'm not including active competitors because their legacy isn't cemented yet, and they also have more forms that they could be running that could become the best form that they ever ran. So Steve and Rudy make this list because I watched them in person, and some of the things that they would do were incredible. Obviously, Steve Tirada innovating the snapu swipe, hugely influential in tricking. Rudy Raynon, his kama form is always what stuck out to me. Some of the fastest cuts and some of the most creative kama manipulations that you'll ever see. So I want to give love to Steve Tirada and Rudy Raynon. And that brings me to, in my opinion, the greatest form that I ever watched in person. And that is by none other than, in my opinion, the greatest weapons competitor of all time, Kalman Choka. Kalman Choka at the 2010 Diamond Nationals did one of the most passionate, incredible forms that I've ever watched in my life. And a lot of people, when I say Kalman Choka, you'll immediately jump to the blindfolded retirement form that he did. And that is not the form that I'm talking about. That was at Diamond Nationals in 2011. That was his retirement form. That was a big moment as well. But in my opinion, his 2010 form was even better than that. This form happened shortly. I don't remember if it was a few weeks or a few months after Kalman's father passed away, and Kalman had made it known that he was dedicating his performance that weekend to his dad. And just the amount of passion combined with Kalman's technical skill, combined with the innovation that Kalman had in doing double sword, combined with the aura that Kalman would present when he would run a form. Like, Kalman's one of the few people that I've ever watched that as soon as Kalman walks on stage, everybody goes silent because everybody knows that's Kalman Choka. That's the guy. That's him. And so everybody, there's just this hush that overcomes the audience. Even like the electric Diamond Nationals audience that I was talking about, even at Diamonds, everybody just quietens down because they know that Kalman Choka is about to do something incredible. And in 2010, that's exactly what he delivered. He had one, in my opinion, the best sword form that I ever watched him run. Finished his form, laid the swords down gently this time, pointed his finger in the air, dedicating the form to his late father. And that is the best weapons form that I've ever seen in my life, that I've ever watched with my own two eyes. In my opinion, Kalman Choka, 2010 Diamond National, just takes the cake. And just one other note about Kalman and Kalman's legacy. One thing that a lot of people don't realize about Kalman is Kalman had a lot of single sword forms that were elite as well. When Kalman would compete in the ring in his divisions, he wouldn't run double sword then. He would run single sword then, get his wins and make it on stage with his single sword, and then he would win his overall grands with his double sword, which is also an extremely impressive feature of Kalman Choka's illustrious career. And so that concludes our main discussion today, which is just a list of, in no particular order, some of the best sport karate forms that I ever had the pleasure of watching in person, not considering current active competitors, and with the one exception of me having to throw in the Casey Marx form from the 2004 Super Grands. And so as we make our transition into the story time segment, it's time for another advertisement. This one is for the Competitive Edge Winter Camp. This is an elite winter camp that's going to be running from December 27th to the 29th in Lebanon, Tennessee, just outside of Nashville, featuring a world-class lineup of instructors and the Competitive Edge coaching staff. Myself, Jackson Rudolph, along with Reed Presley, Cole Presley, Jake Presley, all three Presley brothers, and Mackenzie Emery will all be instructing. There's also an advanced bonus session that you can sign up for to take your training to the next level. Competitive Edge Winter Camp is definitely something that you do not want to miss out on. Register today at myuventex.com. And so now moving on into story time. Today I'm going to tell the story of the 2009 WKA Team USA. And the reason that I chose this story to talk about today is I've seen a lot of talk on social media recently about all of the different world championships that are going on. We just recently had WACO World Championships, WKU World Championships, WKC World Championships. Seems like there's all kinds of world championships going on. I love it. I think it's great for our sport. I think that the more high-level competition that we have going for our sport, the better. But the reason that I bring up this specific team in 2009, and I do have a specific story that I'm going to get to with this team as well, is because actually some of the people on this list were included as members of this team that I had the blessing to be a part of. So that 2009 WKA, which I believe stood for the World Karate and Kickboxing Association, we had an all-star roster. And I'm not even talking about myself. Like, I don't even consider myself one of the all-stars of that team. I wound up winning 5 gold medals at World Championships, but I was a baby. I was like 12 years old at the time. So I wouldn't even consider myself one of the all-stars of that team. That team was loaded. That team also had a young Sammy Smith. That team also had a Matt Immig in his prime. That team also had Corey Lutkus in his prime. That team also had Nick Schneider, who did a synchronized bow form alongside Corey Lutkus. That was incredible. Jarrett Liker was a traditional forms representative for that team. Becca Ross was also on that team. Nikki Stanley was on that team. And I'm probably forgetting people as well. But that team was just loaded. It was so much fun competing on that team because it was one of those things where a lot of us kind of traveled there together. We were on similar flights and everything like that. And there's just a sense of camaraderie. I'm thinking of other people as I'm talking about this. Amanda Chin was on that team. Gabby Wolf was on that team. I mean, the team was just loaded with talent. Will Greenberg was on that team. And we just knew going into it that the United States was going to fly to Spain and that we were going to dominate that World Championships. And for the most part, that's exactly what we did. And it was a huge blessing to be a part of that team. The funny story, especially me having just come back from a trip up to Toronto in Canada, is what happened after one of my gold medal finals in Spain. So mind you, this is happening in Huelva, Spain, and this is 12-year-old Jackson going to compete for World Championships. And what happened was the gold medal final for, I believe it was Weapons with Music, which is just musical weapons. That gold medal final wound up being me against 3 Canadians. They would always run it down to 4, and then those 4 would compete against each other for the medals. And so it was me against these 3 Canadians, and I was fortunate enough, and I ran a good enough form to wind up winning the gold medal. But what was so funny was that I win the gold medal, and then we go up to do the ceremony on the podium, and I'm getting booed by this, huge crowd of Canadians in a different country. We're not in America. We're not in Canada. We're in Spain. And I'm getting booed, this 12-year-old kid, because I beat 3 of the Canadians in the gold medal finals. So that's a funny story. It was something that motivated me when I was a kid. It didn't hurt my feelings at all. And also, I feel like I have a great rapport with the Canadian fan base, especially nowadays. It's an incredible experience getting to come up to Toronto every year and compete in Canada, as well as the Quebec Open, getting to compete up there, because there's such a big bow staff following there. Like when I teach seminars at this tournament, the Toronto International Tournament of Martial Arts Champions, we always get a huge turnout. I think we had between 30 and 40 kids in all 3 of my sessions that I taught this weekend. Just the support for bow staff in general and the support and the love that people show me there is incredible. And I'm super, super grateful for all the support that I get shown in Canada now. But back in 2009 in Spain, the Canadians were not very fond of Jackson Rudolph, but it was okay because the U.S. team was stacked that year, and it was a blessing to be a part of it. And I'm super honored to be able to say that I was on that team with so many great competitors that I mentioned on my list of some of the best forms that I've ever seen run. And so now as we go ahead and transition into our tournament talk about the Toronto tournament that just passed, we're going to give you one more advertisement for the day. This is for Century's Signature Series Weapons. Century has launched 3 Signature Series lines with Team Paul Mitchell members, myself, Jackson Rudolph. I have a bow staff line, the nunchucks line with Danny Etkin, as well as the Kama line with Mackenzie Emery. These are weapons that these athletes designed to be almost the exact same specs that they use in competition. So if you want to compete like the best, you got to get the weapons that the best are using. Go to centurymartialarts.com and type out Jackson Rudolph, Danny Etkin, or Mackenzie Emery to check out the Signature Series products today. And so now we are going on into tournament talk, and I saw a lot of really, really impressive performances from Toronto. I'm going to be talking primarily about our Grand Championship winners, and I'm not going to get to every Grand Championship winner. I'm just going to note a few of the things that stuck out to me and a few of the highlights that I saw. I want to start by talking about Mason Bumba. Now, Mason Bumba competed in the Grand Championship for his fighting division and had one of the coolest comebacks that I've ever seen. So I watched this whole fight, and Mason was fighting because they fight short versus tall for that Grand. And Mason was fighting a kid that was probably my height. So this kid's 6 feet tall fighting little Mason, right? And Mason's got a lot of spunk to him, got a lot of power to him. but he's not my height, you know what I mean? And so Mason has a significant reach disadvantage. And he winds up being down 1 point, but it was grand, so you had to win by 2. He's down 1 point, so they go to overtime. And on that last clash where he got down 1 point, he went down pretty hard. I couldn't tell if he took a shot to the groin or if he like pulled a muscle in his groin. So he was either man hurting, if you will, or he had a little muscle pain going on in the leg there. I couldn't quite figure it out, but he was a little bit hobbled coming out of that last clash and going into overtime. And Mason's somebody that used to train with me on bow a lot, so I was in Mason's corner for this fight, cheering him on and everything. And so I was a little bit uncertain of how it was going to end up after I saw him go down like that. But then Mason gets up, and then he proceeds on the next 3 consecutive clashes. This dude comes in, and Mason just jumps straight up in the air and just slaps this guy in the face with 3 straight back fists. And it was one of the coolest comebacks that I've ever seen, because it was the same technique. It was jump back fist, jump back fist, jump back fist, game over, Mason wins. And it was just such a quick turnaround, and I was really impressed with how Mason turned that fight around and was able to come back and win. Congratulations to you, Mason. That was awesome. Also, congratulations on winning the 1300 Boys Weapons Grand Championship as well. That was exciting to watch too. Moving on to another Mason representing Top 10 USA, Mason Stowell had another dominant performance in the 14-17 forms category. He won the Trad Challenge to get the power ring. Now, this is not just the normal NASCAR Trad Challenge division. Mike Politi actually hosted another traditional challenge event that was like a WKF flag style, where it'd be like 2 competitors face off against each other, and then they kind of ran that down through a bracket style. And Mason Stowell was just incredible. I mean, his power, his execution was just a pleasure to watch in that specific challenge. He also competed in the semifinal of that challenge. He competed against Vincent May, who's of Team NMAC from up in Canada. He also ran an excellent Super Impe. That Super Impe was incredible to watch, but Mason wound up getting the edge and moving on to the final, winning that division. And Mason not only won that traditional challenge division, but he won the Forms overall Grand Championship as well for the 14-17 boys, going up against Cade Trinidou, who I thought had an extremely impressive extreme form as well. Opened up with a massive crowd awakener, which is basically like a corkscrew or a full, where you extend both legs out at the end of it, almost like an X out backflip. He also had, I don't remember if it was a dub cork or a dub full, but he hit that to split in the form. Lots of really difficult tricks in the form that Cade executed really, really well. But the strength and power of Mason Stowell wound up winning the overalls there. So much respect to all those 14-17 boys for throwing down some awesome forms in that night show. A shout out to Competitive Edge member and student of mine, Esteban Tremblay, for winning both the traditional and the CMX 14-17 weapons grands. He was dominant this weekend. Congratulations, Esteban. I'm proud of you, man. And I also want to give a shout out to another student of mine on Competitive Edge, Ben Jones. Ben Jones, now most of you may know Ben as a bow staff specialist, which is why he trains under me, but Ben wound up breaking all of his bows. He broke all of his creative bows in training and preparation for this tournament, didn't have a bow left to compete with, and so he just decides to pick up some commas, make up a comma form, and competed in that stack. I talked about in episode 2 how deep that 14-15 boys weapons division is. And Ben strolls on into that division with commas. He gets 2 second places, and he winds up winning creative weapons and advancing to the runoff with a comma form. So much love and respect to Ben Jones for winning creative weapons with his commas, and then wind up having a drop in that runoff that Esteban would ultimately wind up winning. It's just incredible watching that division, especially watching that runoff. I think that runoff this weekend was Ben, Esteban, PJ Clark, another excellent competitor on a Competitive Edge, and Connor Chastain, an excellent competitor that is commas from Team Infinity. That division is just electric. That was so much fun to watch. Several competitors had some mistakes this weekend, but still, that division is just electric. Moving on to the women's divisions in both women's forms and weapons, Melissa Bayarjon from Canada won both of those grands. Congratulations to Melissa. And then moving on to the men's traditional divisions, I saw some really impressive things, especially in the night show. So once again, just like in the juniors, Mike Politi hosted this kind of 2v2 bracket format traditional challenge division. And the semifinal of that one featured Joey Castro versus Keith Weston, in which Joey Castro would wind up winning that showdown. So congratulations to Joey Castro for that. He ran an excellent form that was as impressive as always. Joey's known for not only his ability to execute very clean traditional forms, but also his intensity and his showmanship when he does them. But in addition to Joey winning, Keith Weston in that same division did one of the most impressive things that I've ever seen in a traditional form. So NASCAR rules, they give you 4 minutes for a performance on stage. And when there's 15 seconds left before you hit that 4-minute mark, you get a 15-second warning so that you know to go ahead and wrap it up, right? But typically nobody ever gets to that 4-minute mark when they're running a form. So Keith Weston performed Super Impe, which is a long form in and of itself, but on NASCAR, most of the time that form takes about 3 minutes. People typically finish with about 10 seconds left at about 2 minutes and 50 seconds. Keith Weston had the endurance and the patience to execute 4 minutes of Super Impe, and then he had probably 20 to 30 seconds of form left when he got a 10-second warning on that form, and then he proceeded to speed through the last probably 10 or 12 moves of Super Impe and did not have a single lapse in technique. Keith Weston executed every single move with the same precision that he would have executed it if he was going at his normal pace, and he did that in 10 seconds. So I was super impressed by both Keith Weston and Joey Castro. They laid down incredible forms. And then later on that night, in the actual NASCAR overall men's forms grand, Keith Weston would wind up winning that. And then in the men's CMX forms grand, Andrew Backus wound up winning all 3, the creative, the musical, and the extreme divisions. And so he did a performance on stage. So congratulations to Andrew Backus for an impressive performance in the CMX forms divisions this weekend. And just wrapping up with a couple of other notes here, congratulations to Anthony Marx for winning both open weight and the heavyweight grand championship. Some really impressive fights from Anthony this weekend. Congratulations to Ben Clark from Duvras Martial Arts of Canada for winning the lightweight grand championship this weekend. Another highlight was the 50 Plus Challenge. This was a 50 Plus Grand Championship that was sponsored by the man Andrew Cabalon, a fellow NASCAR historian. I love listening to Andrew talk about history. He's been around the sport for a long time, and he actually gave, I believe it was $500 sponsorship to the Toronto International Tournament of Martial Arts Champions to run a 50 plus age group overall grand championship. And according to the announcer that night, who was Master Dennis Brown, this was the first time that this has ever happened where we had a husband and wife competing against each other for a grand championship on stage, featuring Mr. John Kim in his traditional sword form and Miss Deborah Kim and her traditional Korean form. They went at it against each other, and that was really fun to watch. I don't really know who kept the prize money on that one, but we'll leave that up to them. But that was extremely entertaining to watch. Congratulations to both Mr. and Mrs. Kim on winning the 50 Plus Challenge sponsored by Andrew Cabalon. And then last, just to cover my results from the weekend, I just want to take a quick minute to just admit how blessed I am and how thankful I am for an incredible season. I was able to win both of the men's weapons grands. I won the traditional weapons as well as the CMX weapons grand, which is it's been a goal of mine all year since they made it a rule on NASCAR now that the men's traditional and CMX are separated. I came close at Diamonds by winning the traditional weapons grand there, but then broke my bow in the CMX. So being able to come back to Toronto and actually being able to secure both the traditional and the CMX overall was something that I was very, very pleased with and very blessed to be in that position. And for me on the season, that makes it 11 NASCAR tournaments that I attended and 11 overall grand championships won. And I just can't express how grateful I am and how much I love the sport and how much I love being able to go out there and compete and how blessed I am to be able to do as well as I'm able to do sometimes and to be able to use that as a way to inspire others. And I hope that any kids that are listening to this podcast can look at that. You know, I just talked about being in 2009, winning a world championship and getting booed, and now, you know, kind of having a little bit of a fan base in Canada and being able to finish off really an incredible season there. I want to thank everybody that helped me along the way this season, from my parents to motivating me and inspiring me to keep pushing even when things were difficult with school, from my coaches at Paul Mitchell, you know, Lauren Carney, the Forms and Weapons coach, who basically taught me how to perform bow staff in the first place, as well as the rest of the executive team, Damon Gilbert, Chris Rappold, Don Rodriguez, even Christine Rodriguez, and Steve Babcock. I couldn't be more grateful for my team and the executive staff for all the love and support that they give me, as well as for all of my teammates for always being there to support me. And I can't wait to see what 2020 has in store for everybody. So congratulations to everyone on an excellent 2019 NASCAR season. That marks the conclusion of the 2019 NASCAR season, and now we're looking forward to 2020. And I can't wait to see what kind of new faces I get to see in the adult division. I know Aiden Considine's moving up. I'm excited to get to compete with him some. And I'm just really excited to see everybody's new forms and get to see what happens in 2020. So this has been episode 3 of the Jackson Rudolph podcast, covering some of the best forms that I ever had the pleasure of watching in person. Be sure to tune in next week for episode 4. Thank you all so much for the love that you've been giving the podcast. I really do appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. And if you like this episode, be sure to like it, share it, comment on it. Thank you so much. This is Jackson Rudolph signing off, and I'll see you next time on the Jackson Rudolph podcast.